Well, following Larry and Tom, I probably can go a little faster, hopefully, but I'm not going to promise that. I'm going to go over basically some of the more recent smoke alarm research that we've conducted in this, and then talk about some new projects and new things we're doing. It's all in the context of some of the issues. I won't call them problems, I'll say issues with smoke alarms. I call them problems. The semantics. Outline, we did some kitchen fire and nuisance alarm experiments. That was funded by CPSC. And there's a report, and you can go to this website and find
We can't hear you.
Find all the details. I'm going to go ahead and stand here. Can you hear me now? Okay. I'll use the mic. I can see that. Then I'm going to talk about a new NIST project that we're going to start this year on kitchen pre-fire detection, but it's also an opportunity to do more nuisance alarm research because there'll be cooking involved. And then we'll talk a little bit about some measurements we're going to do for advanced detectors. You know, this, in some respects, there are different components of this problem. It's messaging, it's how people react to smoke alarms, and it's technology. And at NIST, we're doing technology portions mostly. And then I'll mention briefly some of the codes and standards issues that are going on right now. So we've conducted some kitchen fire and nuisance experiments in a mock-up of a small, you consider this an apartment, with a kitchen here, large room located here. There's a hallway. There's no bedrooms, but we'd assume the doors were closed. We don't have to worry about any of the smoke transport, but we do monitor what's going on in the room. Where we set up actual smoke alarms at different locations, number of them. Some in the kitchen for nuisance tests at a distance of about 6 feet from the cooking appliance, and that's in the code, where the NFP 72 code says nothing closer than 6 feet. And then you could have photos here. And then at area 10 feet, this is where you get to the transition where you could have an ion with a hush or something in the codes. There's an intermediate point. And then there's something beyond 20 feet where the code doesn't speak about nuisance alarms. So the mock-up looks like this, where we have a stove. This is non-combustible cabinetry we conducted for the fire experiments. There's one wooden cabinet here, which for the fire test is sort of the burn area. There's a toaster here right next to the electric range. If you're looking through the large sort of living space room into the kitchen, you can see there's soffits here and there's a soffit on the door. So any smoke's generated has got to build up or cooking the aerosol and then can flow into the room where it sees different smoke alarms at different locations. We instrumented these for a few reasons. We put, of course, the alarms in place. And these were various commercially available smoke alarms at the time. They included ionization, photoelectrics, dual alarms, and some, we'd say, multi-sensor alarms. We also have aerosol characterization instrumentation. Part of that is we're collecting all this data, and that's great. We know something goes off and when it goes off. But if you're going to design a test method for nuisance resistance, you have to know something about the source in more detail. And that's what we're looking at when we take those measurements. The same thing with the gas species. We're trying to figure out what the environment is around the alarms. And then also doing it for the fire test at 5 feet for tenability limits. And then temperatures and the extinction with the smoke meters. And also we can measure the ceiling flows just for the purposes of, you know, these very low velocity flows that might have an impact on the smoke entry or not. For the cooking experiments, the scenarios we looked at were kind of a range of cooking scenarios. These were sort of informed by some testing and research that the CPSC did. And they included broiling. We broiled a hamburger. We broiled a frozen pizza, frying a hamburger, grilled cheese sandwich, stir-frying vegetables, frying bacon, toasting bread. And these are all cooking, normal cooking activities. Never burned on purpose. Stop the test. Whatever's cooked is edible. Okay, and the idea is normal cooking in this small environment, all these alarms at different locations, what happens when alarms, or are they tripping or are they not tripping for these different activities? It's always good to see pictures, and I like to show pictures. You can see some of the activities. You can see this is, if a toaster sitting right here, we toasted a frozen bagel. Frozen bagel is a little different than bread because it starts off frozen, but actually the particles that are given off are fairly similar to toast. When you move from a light toast to a dark toast, you're actually seeing different particles. A very light toast, it's almost everything's invisible. When you get to the dark toast, if you were to look or shine a laser beam above the toaster, you'd see particles. If the laser beam can see them, a photoelectric smoke alarm could probably see them too if the concentration's high enough. Frying activities, like I said, frying in a frying pan, so making grilled cheese sandwich, or there's some margarine or something on the bottom of the pan.
John, just quickly, did you think about using French fries, like deep frying?
They've been done before. I mean, what I'm really looking for is sort of classes. What I was trying to do is get different size particles, because the difference between toasting a bagel or bread, or even broiling a pizza in a broiler, they all look fairly similar in the particle size. So if I was to come up with a test, I don't want to do all of them. I want to do one representative, or try to model one representative one. People have, deep frying before. I didn't specifically do that. We tried boiling potatoes, but that was, because people said the humidity would trip alarms. It never happened in a small space. But we'll have an opportunity later, and I'll show you, because this is not the whole universe of tests, but it had to start somewhere. The next thing is just frying a single hamburger. This is, the sort of size. We have a small room, but I'm not cooking 5 hamburgers at the same time. There's some variations here. And then stir frying is in actually a sort of a wok with a little bit of oil. That's the vegetables, standardized, half cup, and dump them in there, and they're cooked so they're edible. Same with the bacon, and that, it's a dark pan, that's edible, it's not burned. We made sure that it was edible. And then pizza, this is broiler on. I don't show any baking. I've done baking before, but I didn't sort of see a big change in particle sizes. Like I say, this is different class, so we kind of eliminated that for this. You could bake things all day long, and until you open the oven door, you may not get enough particles to do anything. And then broiling a hamburger. So some of the general trends, obviously, are the propensity to alarm depend on the alarm type in the cooking scenario, for one. And then the rate of alarm decreased by either a factor 2.5 or a factor 4 when you move from that close distance to the furthest distance out. That's not surprising. Outside the kitchen, inside the kitchen, there was a variation of the propensity alarm by about a factor of 2 for the different types of detectors. And this is sort of the graph that encompasses all those tests. Every single test is documented, when they went off, et cetera, et cetera. But what this is showing you is that if I take these cooking events and I segregate it into sort of what's on the range top, the frying, the toasting activities, and what's going on in the oven, and I normalize them to 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, because they're not normalized. The number of tests weren't the same equally. And then I said, okay, what's the alarm activation frequency for these tests that I conducted, or this range of tests, as a function of distance? And we had different alarms, and you can see what we see here is you see a grouping of alarms that are higher than everything else, no matter where it's located. That was an ionization alarm, and that was also one of the dual photo ion alarms. Inside the kitchen, there's a big spread. The photo by itself is down here at the lowest alarm activation frequency. It doesn't change much out to 10, but you see all these other detectors start to clump around here. So it's hard to say that there's a big difference between actually one of the duals, which tended to have a less sensitive ion sensor in it, and then there were 2 alarms labeled M1 and M2. Those were, and I'm not going to identify them, but those were what we would call intelligent alarms, where you take maybe an ion CO or ion something else combined. So you can see that these are products on the market. So, without identifying, you can't use this information to go to store and make an intelligent choice. But what I'm trying to do is see a snapshot of where the industry is, and also trying to decide, well, what would be a performance level if we come up with a standard? We're not going to have this. I mean, Larry might want this, but today or in the near term, we're not going to have that. Are we going to have this? Can we define something that says performance relative to these alarms is something like this? We clearly don't want this. And this is sort of taken care of in the standard by itself, because you can't put an ion that close. So that's good, but what's not codified, it's in the NFP72 standard, which says thou shalt not put an ion, but we don't have a test that eliminates this from that location or anything like that. We don't have a performance-based test, it's just in the standard. And then clearly said this kind of sensitivity you don't want by itself, but there may be combinations where you might live with it, but maybe a little better performance close in, and then you'll have something better further out. So that's kind of some of the data to try to crunch to get an idea of of how to come up with some performance standards. The next thing I'll talk about is the kitchen fire test. We had a kitchen, we were doing tests in there, we could do fire tests in there, so we wanted to see, look a little bit at some kitchen fires and the performance of smoke alarms. There was a little bit of data that was conducted in NIST for different type of kitchen fires, basically a pot of oil on a burner. You heat that up. What happens is you fill the whole house up with oil smoke, light-colored smoke. Every detector goes off, and then sometimes later it bursts into flames. These tests were a little different because there was a flaming fire scenario where something catches fire near the stove and transitions to stuff on the countertop and ignites the main fuel source, which is a kitchen cabinet, above it. And so that's what we had. We had two different cabinet types we looked at, a press board with solid oak doors and then a press board with a thin plastic veneer. And then two ignition scenarios. I'll look at them more in detail. We'll go to next. The first scenario, again, this is the cabinet. So now we took that stove out, and I put just a coil burner here because I don't want to burn a stove up. And this is easily repeatable. There's a paper towel that actually, something drapes over here. It's a paper towel here. That ignites, starts to burn the roll. There's some foam plates, a bag of chips, and a coffee maker. That's all it is. It's not that crowded of a countertop, but you've got stuff here that's spread over here. But here's the main fuel source. So this ignition source is going to play onto here. And then just look at ignition source sensitivity. We got rid of the coffee maker, but added more. A bag of corn chips, a large bag of potato chips, some oil-soaked stuff like you were deep frying or frying something and soaking it and then moving away. Microwave popcorn, basically to see if it will pop all over the place. It never did. It just burned. It was a little disappointing.
Boys and their toys.
But it's a fuel. It's a fuel. We had some interesting jetting out of that box. So stepping back, these tests are actually not in the room. These are under a furnace calorimeter, so we can see the fire growth rate for this thing that's not confined in a room. And this is the scenario is the first scenario with the coffee pot, and then it's the cabinet with the wood doors. And you can see this initial. This is at the peak heat release rate, what the fire looks like, and that's almost at it's over 650 kilowatts. That's a pretty large fire for a small space. If it had the oxygen, it would probably flash over the room almost by itself. But it takes some time to get there. Upholstered furniture typically would go up, somewhere ramping up around the 200 seconds. So even though these fires are big, they're a little slower growing than the upholstered furniture fires we've looked at. And the other scenario is the same ignition source, the coffee pot, but different cabinet. And we got, actually, it's not the coffee pot. It's the same cabinet without the coffee pot. So without that plastic coffee pot burning in for a long time, you didn't get the fire to break into the cabinet and really get going. It just went out actually by itself. And didn't peak at but 100 kilowatts. But what's interesting, at least for the test we're going to do, that's big enough that we can do calculations with smoke alarms and whether they're effective. It doesn't have to keep going up to flash over. And this is interesting. This is the cabinet. The ignition source, I can't see if the coffee pot's here or not. And it's not, but you can see what happens here. It flashes over the whole cabinet, but it doesn't break in and it just died away. But again, we did those tests to see how smoke alarms at different locations from here, the kitchen would perform. And then this is just some snapshots of one of the scenarios. And this is at time 0, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, and then 6-minute snapshots. So about 6 minutes, you would deem this probably as escape. You'd have trouble escaping here because of the heavy smoke. Even though you can look at the fire and you can see where the fire is, you turn around, everything's black. You can't navigate. And then the other one is they're similar. So even though they didn't grow to huge fires, they provide enough information to check the smoke alarm effectiveness. And the other thing is that when we saw in these fires that they tended to self-extinguish because the oxygen concentration was dropping. We had large carbon monoxide at the end of the test, quite high actually. So some of the observations were obviously that the ignition source and cabinet type affected the fire growth rate. And in these fires in these small spaces, when we did them in the test spaces, they tend to limit the oxygen and either go out and then produce a lot of carbon monoxide. But every smoke alarm that we tested at any distance, that's up to 20 feet away, gave quite a bit of time for egress, at least greater than 90 seconds before you might say, you're going to have trouble seeing through your exit route and deem it not safe. So that was, there wasn't a need to say, like, these are kitchen fires. You had to be near the kitchen to detect them, and save yourself. Really, you probably don't, and that's good. So, I mean, some people say kitchen fires, they're most prevalent. They're what you want to stop. What would you do? Put the smoke alarm near the kitchen? That's a wrong message, probably. At least the data looks like that. I'll talk a little bit about some research we're going to start this year, and that's kitchen pre-fire detection. And in addition to that, it gives us a chance to do more nuisance alarm tests. But the objective of this test is actually to determine smoke levels or other fire signatures in the corresponding times before igniting actual food items, and see if you can sense this pre-fire conditions and come up with some way to stop the transition to fire through manual or automatic interactions. And whatever intervention technologies you come up with. And this is conducted in a small room we have in this. It's just a 10 by 10 by 8 foot high room that we mocked up as a kitchen. It has a vent here, so we can have a low controlled vent, so it's like going out to the rest of the house, so you don't have just complete buildup in a small room. So the planned experiments are actually going to be unintended cooking scenarios that will be allowed to transition to fires. And that's heating the vegetable oil, and then frying chicken or potatoes in oil. We probably aren't going to have a big fat fat fryer because that's a huge fire, but maybe a half-inch or so of oil in a shallow pan, and crisping your French fries. You leave the room, you go do something else, and it's going to transition to flames. Frying bacon, just like Tom did, and let it transition. Another thing, the guy who's doing most of the work, Rick Johnson. He doesn't work in the 90s, and he found that you put sugar in a pan, caramelize it, it bursts into flames. It may not spread to anything, but at least we'll get a fire out of it. And also what we got to look at is some heavy smoke-producing, but normally attended cooking scenarios. If you're broiling a steak, you don't want to have everything shut down because you're broiling your steak. So that might be, if it's automatic, maybe there's a sensor that knows somebody's there, or some other way you can stop it before it automatically shuts it down. Stir frying also is another scenario you might want to look at. But what's good is we want to differentiate sort of normal cooking activities that most likely will not ignite and spread fire, so just to gather sort of that extra piece of data. The measurements are just smoke concentrations, gas concentrations, thermal. And this thermal could be a surface thermal or air temperature, because there are some devices that use surface thermal. And with and without the range hood running. So if a range hood is running, it's sucking everything out. Having something up on the ceiling maybe it's not going to be very effective because it doesn't see anything. So you might have to use some in-dock sensing if you could, or maybe plan for that. And the other thing is to examine the boundary between what you might consider a nuisance alarm and what you might consider the pre-fire conditions that you want to act on. Again, we're not looking to put a smoke alarm in the kitchen. We're maybe trying to put something in the kitchen that responds to the pre-fire, the unattended cooking, which you may be unaware of. You may not have a smoke alarm tell you something's going on. Maybe passed out, who knows. But that's the example. That's the situation. And the next thing is we'll talk a little bit about advanced detection research. This is sort of what we like to do in NIST. This is sort of a technology thing. We don't build smoke alarms, but we can certainly collect data and examine sensors that we might think may improve the situation. So looking at examining sensors and algorithms that could be used with these sensors that could produce early fire detection and robust discrimination of nuisance or non-fire nuisance conditions. And you do that through detailed measurements of the smoke and the aerosols, the gases, thermal, everything you think somebody might use to come up with a algorithm and whether it can be measured and what sensitivities you need to measure that. Along the lines of that, I built this, there's a smoke nephelometer and an aerosol polarimeter together. The top section, what we call a nephelometer, that's the polarimeter. Polarimeter sounds fancy, but you can think of this as sort of a super configurable photoelectric smoke detector. That's really what it is. Because it's using light scattering measurements, and that's what a photoelectric detector does. But I can control things like the wavelength of the detector that I want to look at. Most photolite detectors are near infrared, but you can gain information if you're looking at visible light. Also the angle, you might be able to look at that. So you can collect a lot of data every second for all different sources. I can put nuisance sources, fire sources, whatever I want in here. And if I want to get really fancy, I would go down the lower section and do the polarimeter. This is polarized light. The good thing about polarized light, you polarize it and then you detect the polarized state. It's not just detecting the intensity, it's really how the light's polarized. You can start to discriminate things like soot, which you know comes only from fires, from anything that looks anything else, like a smoldering smoke. It's much more difficult, but it's possible to do that. So this is the kind of research we'd like to go through all our sources with, and nuisance sources, and build a big database, and then somebody can take that. I may not do it. I don't expect I'm smart enough to do it. But they might take all the information, they might add in 1 or 2 more sensors to it, and come up with what Larry wants and what we all want, is something that's very intelligent and very robust. But this is not going to happen tomorrow. Now, briefly, I want to talk about the codes and standards. There's a couple things going on in UL 217, 268, or the polyurethane foam fire tests. These are new tests that are being proposed to be added into UL 217, 268 to sort of say, technology neutral, doesn't matter what you have, but here's a new test we want you to pass. And it happens to be mimicking the smoldering upholstered furniture fire early on. So you can imagine that one technology might do better. And then there also might be a flaming test that sort of challenges another technology. But it doesn't matter. We want to base this on performance, so that this has some experimental data that I've looked at and trying to be used to define the performance criteria for these new tests. And then additionally, there's a task group for a nuisance alarm test in UL 217, 268. Again, doesn't matter what the technology is, it might be whatever you have, but can we come up with a test that defines some minimum performance that we want all detectors to meet, or maybe detectors that are only used some distance from the kitchen? I don't know, but that's what we're trying to develop here. And you can see, going back to some of the work I presented, that's sort of what was feeding into this. And also in NFPA 72, household alarms chapter, there is a nuisance resistant alarm requirement required in the year 2019. There's actually one earlier that will probably be changed, and everything will be out to 2019. So there's something in there that we're trying, that's basically pushing and driving this thing to have this nuisance requirement come up in 217. That's just, I just wanted to show that to make sure everybody's aware of that. So that's all I have.
Thank you.